All right, that issue has been off for a few weeks, and MPs have been away from Ottawa too. But next week, the political action begins again. Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce are all here and anxious to talk. But first, let's get up to speed on some of what's been happening these past few weeks.
We refuse to single out Israel for criticism on the international stage.
And Stephen Harper didn't, and for that he received very favorable Israeli media and public reaction. Not so much from Palestinian legislators, though, who heckled him. The Prime Minister took dozens of Canadians with him on the trip, a good percentage of whom are donors to the Conservative Party. There are also a number of different religious leaders, including some from groups who openly promote anti-gay positions.
You guys don't get a joke, huh?
That's a Tory MP on the trip, a backbencher named Mark Adler. And here's what he now says was a joke.
Jeremy, you get in?
When he tried to get close to the PM near the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem.
It's the re-election. This is the $1 million shot.
And how awkward is this? John Baird next to John Kerry in Washington last week. Watch how the U.S. Secretary of State reacts to this remark from the day before from Canada's foreign minister.
The time for Keystone is now.
We're just not at that point yet.
If that caused tension, perhaps this tweet this week from Baird about Kerry on Syria smoothed things over. John Kerry delivers powerful opening remarks. Powerful. And who do the Conservatives think will be the main opposition in the next election? Maybe there was a hint in this letter from the party's new executive director. In 2015, Canadians will have the opportunity to choose between Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. No mention of the official opposition leader, Tom Mulcair. And finally, not sure what you can say about this, other than it happened in Israel. All right. I want each of you to come up with what you think was the most significant of all those different events of these past few days. And, you know, Andrew, you're the resident Twitter music critic, so I guess you'll be picking that last point.
Well, maybe I'll save that in my back pocket. Let me start with, I think, the Baird-Kerry two-step, if you will. It's an extraordinary thing on a file this big, this important, this sensitive, to have both the Foreign Minister of Canada and indeed the Prime Minister of Canada essentially yelling in public, metaphorically or otherwise, at the President to make up your mind, get a move on. That's not usually how things are done. I can't imagine they think it's going to be terribly helpful. I can't imagine it would be terribly helpful. One suspects it's more directed at either domestic consumption and or they're looking past the president, the current president, to the midterms in 2004, this current mid-year, and some potential successor. But it shows you certainly the degree to which there is no love lost, I think, at least on this file between those two leaders. And more broadly, that relations are not in the greatest of shape between the two of them.
I thought Tom Mulcair made an interesting point because he pointed out the difference between what Harper had said and what Baird said. Harper had said, I won't take no for an answer, and Baird said, I'll take any answer.
Very good point, absolutely.
Yeah. But say something. I agree with Andrew that if we're looking for significance, that was certainly the more significant event. And you couldn't help but think that if Stephen Harper had expended as much capital having chemistry with Barack Obama rather than with Israel, he would probably have moved Keystone XL forward a lot faster. It looked from this episode and the episode of the Prime Minister saying, I won't take no for an answer, that by now they expect no for an answer and they've just walked away from this. On the musical thing, I think there's a lot of debate this year over whether the Prime Minister will really run for another election. That should be his day job and not singing.
Bruce, your thoughts?
Well, I was struck by the recruiting letter from Dimitri Soudis. I got one, so I assume probably maybe 250,000 other Canadians got one. Mm-hmm. What struck me about it was this happened during the same period of time that the fundraising dynamic in Canadian politics was really changing. You remember a few years ago, the Conservatives brought in new rules basically that reduced or removed ultimately the public subsidies for parties. And I think what they were trying to do then was put a foot on the throat of the Liberal Party, not teach a man to fish kind of thing. Now, Fast forward to the last quarter, and we've got this ironic situation that's developed where necessity being the mother of invention, the Liberals have actually figured out how to raise more money from more people than they ever have before. And they're very close behind the Conservatives in terms of fundraising. And of course, they're ahead in the polls as well. So there's quite a different dynamic that's shaping up. And I think the reference to it's us or Justin Trudeau is a reflection of the political choice as the Conservatives see it right now.
Which is interesting, because you would think they would be wanting to stress, to play them off against each other and divide the non-Conservative vote. But it looks like, A, they see more of a threat from the Liberals, but also that they see there's more opportunity perhaps that some of that vote is soft, that they can take some of that back, and that it's convenient for them, therefore, to polarize this as a Liberal-Conservative choice and basically
Also
forget about the
that
NDP.
They need to. I mean, about 30% of the people who said that they voted Conservative in the last election say they're not going to vote Conservative right now. And they may change their minds and go back to the Conservative Party, but if you look at where those voters have gone, almost all of them have gone to the Liberal Party, not to the NDP. So the Conservatives absolutely need to get those voters to open their minds up again to voting Conservative.
Yeah, I think they have realized that the divide to conquer strategy is not going to get them there because of what Bruce has already said. They're not paying attention to Thomas Mulcair because they also cannot see that he is coming after their votes. So even if Thomas Mulcair was doing really well, Justin Trudeau would be the big threat because he can, even if he goes down, soften up the Conservatives for a loss. So whichever way you look at it from their angle, they're danger to them and they have to be fighting him and they can't count on the NDP to do it for them.
You know, a wise old political hand told me just in the last couple of weeks that if you're going to win in politics, you got to have three things going for you. You got to have the polls in your favor, you got to have crowds when you appear, and you have to have money. And if you have all three things, you got a really good shot at winning. And of the three parties right now, only one's got all those three things. There's no election right now, but at the moment.
But you can win an election without being ahead in the polls at the beginning of a campaign, and you can also win a lot of seats, i.e. the NDP in Quebec, without having money. But it certainly helps to have at least 2 out of 3, and I think crowds, frankly, are important because they show that you are of interest to people. But at the end of the day, I don't think that at this point we can say about any of the three parties that one of them looks like a sure bet to win the election.
And I would say the Liberal Party is unusually uncommitted support. What do you mean? That it's very soft. It's not based on anything particularly real other than they like the cut of Justin Trudeau's jib at this point. But there is a long time for both of the other parties to go after that and to soften that up. And he's got some real weaknesses. I think I'd flip around and say, the party that's not raising a lot of funds, that's not doing very well in the polls, that's not getting a lot of momentum going is the NDP right now. And you can see that with this affordability tour that they've cooked up for the leader to go on, hammering some very old NDP themes. This is not the sound of a party that is on the move and expanding its base. This is the sound of a party that's reminding its base why it's there.
There's one other thing I think that the Conservatives have done to kind of tie one arm behind their back as they approach the next combat, which is it's not that they should try to inculcate a kind of a love relationship with the media, but they've gone out of their way to create a really toxic relationship with the media. And so as I was watching the coverage of the Israel trip, I was remarking on the fact that the Prime Minister gave quite an eloquent speech, a very passionate speech. He laid out some complex thoughts that were really important to him and that he wanted the country to hear. And by and large, people were exposed to that. Contrast that with how little he does to communicate in that fashion when he's here in the country. And most of that, I think, has become, is because step by step over several years, the conservative movement, if I can call it that, has decided that it's the lamestream media, the mainstream media, the media party. There's an all-out attack, nonstop, on the media. And of course, the corrosion really becomes self-defeating for the Conservatives if they can't find a way to turn that around.
And what the one consequence of that is you remove one of the great strengths of Harper, which is when he chooses to be, he's a very effective communicator. So the image people have of him is this coldly calculating, cynical, non-communicative guy. He goes over to Israel, gives, as you say, I thought a very strong speech, also gave several press conferences where he explained his views on this in much greater detail, with great force, great passion, great conviction, great, I would say, even eloquence. As you say, when do we see that here? Because he's decided that that's not what you're going to see of him here.
Well, it was 8 years ago tonight that he won the election that made him Prime Minister of Canada. On the 8th anniversary, not an insignificant number of years for anybody to be in office. What's the story? What is the Stephen Harper story? Where are we at?
He's certainly recreated a conservative coalition. And remember when he became leader, this was, fragments in the universe, and people were writing about the Liberals being the natural governing party way into this century. That hasn't happened. So that has kind of happened. I don't think that it's gelled, and we'll see when he leaves whether this will hold. He has shifted the needle on how governance is done. I'm not sure that that is permanent either. At this juncture, I have to say that legacy-wise, I think that if he left tomorrow, in 3 years, we could say that he recreated a Conservative Party. And beyond that, it's a bit like the ocean coming on the sand. At the end of the day, at the beach, all those castles, they disappear.
I guess I look at it from the standpoint of if he wanted to imagine a legacy that people would know him for, it would probably be that he's been a good steward of the economy. And I think the reality there is that...
That's starting to be challenged.
Well, it is
though.
starting to be challenged. And certainly if you look at, there's about 38% who say the country's going in the right direction. Against the economics right now, unemployment's below 8%.
But it's above
the fiscal
7%.
situation is... The fiscal situation's improving, probably see a balanced budget in the next little while. There should be better credit accruing to the government. And so what's really going on is that people are saying the economy is not great, it's not terrible. I'm not sure it would be that much worse if we picked somebody else. And so that calling card is gone.
After 8 years, though, I think I lean more to Chantal's view that that's a pretty thin legacy, all things considered. When you consider that the aim of all this was to make themselves the permanent party of power, to replace the Liberals with that, to own a large part of the political spectrum, to remake the map of Canada, the political map of Canada that way. And they are at 28% in the polls in relatively good times. I'm not saying it's boom times, but relatively good times, the kind of times that you would generally think a governing party would not be at that level. They haven't used up a lot of political capital on important initiatives the way you would sometimes be unpopular midterm. They just seem to have kind of frittered it away by just consistently alienating people. So here they are now at 28%. They were at close to 40% in the last election. They've lost, a good third or more of their support.
Look at the big battles that some previous governments had. When Pierre Trudeau left, the Charter of Rights and Freedom stayed. When Brian Mulroney left, free trade, the Liberals kept. The GST, the Liberals kept. When Jean Chrétien left, no one took the Clarity Act and threw it out the window. Balanced budget stayed. The health accord remained. What of Stephen Harper's rule? Will the next government keep a habit for secrecy?
And that's a very good point, is oftentimes that's your legacy, is what the other parties have to keep. And secondly, who succeeds you? And that's the other question is there any sort of serious roster of contenders to succeed him? And it's pretty thin.
Well, one thing they'll keep is the cut in the GST.
True
I can't see anybody doing that one back again. Anyway, we're out of time. Good discussion. Next week, the House is back. Next week, At Issue will be back.